This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a historian of Zionism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose current research focuses on Zionist youth movements in 1960s America. He is joining us now on the line from Wisconsin. Dr. Tal Elmaliach, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thank you.
So the 1960s were in many ways a watershed period for American Jews, also but not only in their relationship to Zionism. Can you please take us through briefly through the evolution of American Zionism and specify what exactly changed in the 1960s?
Yeah, so first of all, the 1960s is not a watershed only regarding the American Zionism. It's a watershed which related to the whole position of Jews in America, not only Zionists, because Jews went through a tremendous change after the Second World War, becoming from immigrants, because the waves of immigration took place generally at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So after World War II, they absorbed and they became middle class, and they actually became a very important, a significant part of the American public life. So this is a watershed of the general life of Jews in the United States. Now, American Zionism emerged at the beginning of the century, but started to be an important political force during the First World War under the rule of Judge Brandeis, which was the leader of the American Zionism. After that, he was replaced, but still American Zionism remained a very important force that helped and supported the Israeli Yeshuv and the Zionist movement around the world. And we have to understand that America basically became a very important and leading empire, I would say, after the two world wars because of the destruction that Europe
But American Zionism wasn't quite the same as European Zionism or even Palestinian or later Israeli Zionism.
Basically, it was a difference in, I would say, two main issues. First, that it wasn't really involving Aliyah for Israel, because Jews from welfare states and from modern states, which haven't been under any threat, didn't really immigrate to Israel, and they preferred to support the Zionist project by other means, other than immigrating to Israel.
Which means
and second,
financial and diplomatic?
Basically, yeah, diplomatic and financial. And of course, the American, both financial and diplomatic help to Israel was crucial and extremely helpful. And today there is also a change and a shift in the historical discourse about the American role about Zionism, which really affects the whole way of thinking about Zionism, not as a project that it was centered in Israel or in Europe, but the American part in Zionism is now being rethinked and brought back to the
because for American Jews, by and large, it was Zionism without Zion.
Yeah, basically you're right. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
And another change, another difference, I would say, is that while the Israeli labor movement was eventually becoming hegemony in the Zionist movement, both in the Yeshuv in Eretz Israel and in the European countries, because it was the most efficient force for organizing the immigration by the Chalutz movement and the youth movements and everything. In America, it wasn't the labor movement that was very dominant, both because socialism in America was never a very acceptable political force, and also because the Zionist Americans were more related to general Zionism, meaning liberal Zionism or progressive Zionism rather than socialism. Although progressive Zionism were highly attracted to the pioneer movement because pioneering is something different from socialism. Although in Israel we basically connecting them because they were both part of the same political movement. Mm-hmm. But in the United States, there wasn't any problem to be a capitalistic, liberal Zionist, which is admiring the pioneers because of the virtue and enthusiasm they are showing in conquering the frontier.
If we go now to the youth movements, they were an extension of political parties and youth movements, Zionist youth movements in Europe and in Palestine and later Israel. In their case, there was this clear association between pioneering and socialism. So what kind of role did they play in post-war Jewish life with that baggage?
So the very interesting process that happened here is that the Zionist youth movements were not very popular in the United States or very successful in the first half of the 20th century, in opposite to what happened in Europe. Mm-hmm. It started to be, I would say, its ideas started to be very popular during the 60s. Why is that? During the 60s, the Jews were participating in huge numbers comparing to their part in the population in the New Left. It connects to the historical relations the Jews had with the left and with radical movements, which took place also in Europe, but in the United States it was very notable that they were the leaders of the civil rights movements and the anti-Vietnam War movement. No, though not as Jews, but as Americans that were radicals, it happened to be the Jews, because Jews, as I told you, were the ones who were most attracted to the radical way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And in 1967, after the Six-Day War, and actually it happened a little bit before that, when a very important change and transformation started to happen in the New Left, when it started to be actually anti-Israeli. At the beginning of the 60s, Israel wasn't a very important part of the agenda of the New Left, but in the middle of the 60s, both the Jewish help for the Afro-American civil rights movement was starting to be a little bit hostile to Jews because they felt the Jews are actually ruling their struggle, and they wanted them to get out of the struggle because they wanted it to be their own effort. Mm-hmm. And both after the 1967 war, people started to take Israel not as David, if to take the biblical metaphor, but as Goliath, because it was so strong and captured the territories and didn't go so easily to a peace process. And then the New Left began to present Israel as a colonialist or imperialist force combined with Western imperial forces like America or France or Britain.
But did this pose an insurmountable contradiction for the Jews? Did Israel play a very significant role in the political worldview as well as their leftist orientation?
Well, Israel, as I said before, Israel signaled for American Jewry and for America in general a very, I would say, it was a project that presented values of justice, historical justice, and it also showed all kinds of attempts to reach, I would say, a very moral society. So it was some kind of a myth that until 1967 attracted a lot of support. After 1967, American Jewry, as part of the New Left, began to be very controversial about Israel became very controversial towards them.
But still, the support for Israel among American Jews has been overwhelming for the past, I don't know how many decades.
Yeah, but, things that you are now recognize, like the lack of support of Israel, which is going under a very notable process of declining, started from there, actually. After 1967, Israel became a controversial issue among American Jewry. After 1967, it took some years after that you will begin to notice American Jewry that is, I would say, not supporting all sides of Israeli politics. It took some years to see that this process is taking place, like in the Israeli society as well.
And in the 1960s, the Zionist youth movements themselves, did they amplify that process or mitigate it? What kind of role did they play in this scheme of affairs?
That was actually the time when the ideology of the Zionist socialist youth movements like Habonim and HaShomer HaTzair started to be very popular, not the movements themselves, but their ideology. Why is that? Because it combined historically the particular feelings and the universal feelings towards Zionism and Jewish life as a whole. It combined both the support in the existence of the Israeli state, but it also wanted the Israeli state to be based on democratic values and equality and the care for the suffering of other populations. So what happened
basically
was
what you're saying is that it was suddenly okay to be a socialist.
Yeah, basically it started to be okay to be socialist, though this ideology was called at that time radical Zionism, not socialist Zionism, because maybe it was too much for the American ears. It was called radical Zionism, and from 1967 onward, you could see thousands of young Jewish Americans, mostly students, that are being the supporters of this ideology, to be both radical and Zionist, something that wasn't actually part of the sphere of ideology of Jews in America before 1967, and that was actually an idea that existed all the time in Habonim and the Shomer HaTzair youth movements in North America, but it started to be popular only after 1967.
Did this revival of old-school Zionism, as you've just described, did it translate into a revival of other practices, such as Aliyah, or a more traditional form of Zionism?
First of all, there was a big wave of Aliyah from the United States after 1967. Many of the people who made Aliyah were young people, were radical Zionists. The important thing is that not many of them stayed, and not many of them actually made Aliyah. And many of the people that today in American Jewry are still somehow supported of radical Zionism were part of this, I would say, ideological and political and social scene in the late 60s. I mean, they were either graduates of youth movements or participating in all kinds of organizations that those youth movements established in order to absorb the huge numbers of supporters, because it was just too big for them. And it wasn't about youth movements anymore. There were students' movements. Right. So there was all kinds of institutional effort to absorb them. Many of them didn't make Aliyah, and today they are a very important part of the Jewish American political sphere. They are the supporters of J Street, for example. Both Zionist and they're not radical, but they are either two-state supporters. The socialism left this agenda, but the dovish point of view is still there.
Now, the inevitable question is, what about Bernie Sanders? To what extent is he really a representative of that generation?
I would say is the most notable example of this generation. He was there in the 60s as a radical Jew, not as a Zionist, but after 1967, many, like Bernie Sanders, were somehow affiliated with Israeli movement, Israeli-based movements. And you could see that, by the way, Bernie Sanders as well spent some time in the kibbutz, and he might, I don't know if personally he was part of any kind of organization that was organized by the Israeli Sochnut, the Israeli government, because after 1967 they supported those organizations of radical Zionism in the United States, but many of them did, without knowing, participated all kinds of activities that were actually financed and organized by shlichim, emissaries from Israel, in order to somehow organize all this amazing energy to be both radical and Zionist. But Bernie Sanders He's not too much of Zionist maybe today, but he was there. He was there. He made this whole course that other people do, coming to the kibbutz, becoming radical, being activating in all kinds of radical...
But Tal, if we stay on Bernie Sanders, maybe the fact that he's really the textbook example, and looking at him today and how he distanced himself from Zionism, and the fact that he's no longer a Zionist, does it say much about that kind of radical Judaism or Zionism that was prevalent in the 1960s and where it is today?
Yeah, well, I think that the synthesis between the radical and the Zionist ideas was somehow disintegrated. And maybe Bernie Sanders is not aware to the fact that it still exists as a political option in Israel to be both radical and Zionist. The problem is that many Jews in America take it that either you have to be a completely supporter of Israel or that you are becoming anti-Zionist. And this is not true. You can be pro-Zionist and you can choose from all kinds of political trends in Israel what kind of Zionist you want to be. Because not all the Zionist trends in the Israeli politics, that is, of course, obvious to everyone that is Israeli, is going to support Benjamin Netanyahu agenda in all kinds
When
of
did
issues.
this disintegration come about? When did it become sort of acceptable that you can't be pro-Israel and pro-social justice?
Well, it actually started in the 1970s, and it was something that followed also all kinds of processes that was part of the Israeli left. Because in Israel as well, you became either right-wing or radical left-wing, and I would say the more moderate agenda somehow just disappeared as a political option from the Israeli politics. Either you would be considered as cooperating with the right, or you're cooperating with the radical left, but you cannot be in Israel. How many people do you know in Israel that consider themselves to be both radical and Zionist? Either you're ultra-Zionist or ultra-radical. And this is an agenda that is not considering the option of synthesis. And this is an historical synthesis that was a very important part of Jewish political life for more than 100 years.
Mm-hmm. And that reached its apex in the 60s, as you said. Dr. Tal Elmaliach, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. So thank you very much for joining us today. You're a historian of Zionism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in Zionist youth movements in 1960s America. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
מה קרה לחמודה? זה אהובי שלא רוצה ומצא לו נע